You ever have a promise hang over you so long, it starts to feel heavier than the truth? 35 years. That's how long Lynette Brooks lived with one she didn't quite understand. One she wasn't sure she could keep, and it all started with an ordinary old barn and a man she thought she knew as well as her own heartbeat. You know what I mean? Nebraska's a place where secrets blow around just like tumbleweeds, catching on old fences and empty windows. Out on the prairie, where the sky runs so far you can't see the end, there stood this plain little house spilling white paint, porch that moaned under your feet, a mailbox hanging on for dear life. Lynette left a world of Atlanta traffic and fluorescent lights for this, a promise of something quieter, maybe something more real, with Jonathan Brooks, a man built like a pickup and twice as stubborn. Thing is, Jonathan wasn't the storybook type. No poetry, no grand confessions. He loved steady and silent. A fresh pot of coffee waiting, a steady hand on your shoulder, tires checked before every road trip, eyes that never flinched from their promises. Their life wasn't fireworks, more like the slow burn of embers, mornings on the porch, dinners shared in easy silence, her hand finding his back on the rough days. Ordinary, maybe, but solid. But behind that sense of home, there was always the barn, an old thing, sagging in the corners, locked up tight with a padlock that caught the sun just right. Lynette asked about it once, all hope and ideas, thinking maybe they'd fix it up together. Jonathan just shook his head, eyes on the floor, said, "I'd rather you didn't go in there. Not safe. Old tools, rust, nails." The look on his face, serious, closed off, made her stop asking. And that's how it went. One locked barn, one quiet question, and a door unseen but solid growing between them. Over the years, Lynette learned to live with not knowing. Men need their space, she told herself. Everyone's got little corners of themselves they don't share, right? Still, she noticed the odd things, the way Jonathan sometimes disappeared at night, flashlight bobbing out back, coming back with mud on his boots, not a word about where he'd gone. Packages arrived for him, odd shapes, slipped under his arm, and carried straight to the barn. When she asked, he'd shrug, "Tools. Work stuff. End of story." 6 years in, curiosity got the better of her. She tried peering through the barn window, but all she saw was shadow and shapes, like the place didn't want to be seen. She let it go. She told herself she trusted a man, she did. Most days, but the barn was always there, a quiet itch she couldn't scratch. Life rolled on, full of routines. Her job at the library, his hours at the Sinclair station, Sundays at church, and pie at the diner. No one looking in would have guessed there was anything amiss except for that locked door and the quiet that grew up around it. Over time, her curiosity turned into something deeper. Not suspicion, just a sense that the barn held something old, something that belonged to Jonathan before it ever belonged to them. There were nights Lynette would ask, "Why won't you let me see inside?" Jonathan would sip his beer, gaze fixed out toward the horizon. "It's just not something I'm ready to share," he'd say, soft but final. Maybe not ever. That was the end of it. They tried, for children know how they tried. Tests, appointments, hopeful calendars that turned into bitter reminders. The grief came in waves, silent, unspoken, like ivy crawling up the walls, filling the cracks in their lives. After a while, they didn't even talk about it anymore. Let the silence settle in. One morning, Lynette found herself standing by the barn again, the padlock cold in her hand, wondering for the thousandth time what could be so precious, so painful, that even love couldn't open the door. She let the thought go. Life carried on, though not always kindly. Then came a summer that would change everything. Jonathan started to fade, slowly, at first, back aches, lost appetite, fatigue that stuck to him like a shadow. He brushed it off. Just age, he'd say, but his clothes started hanging off him. His eyes got that hollow look. Lynette made the appointment herself, and when the doctor said pancreatic cancer, advanced, inoperable, it was like the world shrank to the ticking of the clock on that beige clinic wall. Jonathan refused treatment, wanted to spend his last days at home, in his own bed, coffee cup by his side, porch creaking under his weight. Lynette became his caretaker, his anchor. She learned to manage the pills, to carry him through the hard nights, reading to him when he couldn't sleep, holding his hand when words failed. On one of the better days, Jonathan gripped her wrist and said, "If something happens, then go in there." Lynette promised, even though it tasted bitter. That night, he whispered, "I kept it for us. You might not understand." I had to. Then he drifted off, and she was left with more questions than answers. When Jonathan passed quietly, at home Lynette moved through the funeral, the days after, like a ghost herself. The house was full of him, boots by the door, his scent on old shirts, his razor on the bathroom shelf. But everywhere she looked, the barn was waiting, calling to her in the night. Finally, after nights of standing at the window, coffee gone cold in her hand, Lynette found the key tucked in an unmarked envelope in Jonathan's nightstand. She stood at the barn door as the sun rose, breath tight, hand trembling as the key slid into the lock. The door swung open with a sigh. Inside, sunlight slanted through the boards, catching on rows of children's drawings pinned to the wall's crayon figures, lopsided suns, a spotted dog, and in blocky letters, for Mom and Dad. "I love you. Our family." There was a bookshelf of picture books, a battered teddy bear, a wooden train, a crib with a peeling white finish, a knitted blanket, a stuffed elephant. It was a nursery built for a child who'd never come. On a small table, Lynette found a spiral notebook. On the first page, in Jonathan's neat block letters, "Diary of a Father. For you, my child, if you ever find this." She sat on the dusty floor, legs giving out, and turned the pages reading of imagined milestones, first steps, scraped knees, stories Jonathan had invented for a child that only ever lived in their dreams. Each entry a piece of a world built out of hope and heartbreak. He wrote, "I bought the elephant today. He'll guard your dreams, little one. Your mother looked tired. I want to tell her I still believe, but the words caught in my throat. So, I came here and wrote them instead. Sometimes he gave the child a name, sometimes just you. Sometimes he'd write about Lynette, how he'd watched her in the garden, wishing he could say the things that weighed on him. The grief she'd carried alone, he'd carried here turned into drawings, toys, dreams. It hit her, then Jonathan hadn't kept her out to hide something dark or out of spite. He was trying to protect the only dream they had left, to keep hope alive in a way that wouldn't break them both. Her tears fell hot and fast, soaking into the old wood, grief rising up for the child they never had, for the man who had borne so much of it in silence, for herself and all the years spent outside that locked door. Days blurred after that. Lynette read every word, touched every toy, dusted the shelves, added a few small things of her own, a faded doll from her own childhood, a photo, a storybook her father once read her. The barn became a living memory, not just his, but there's a place where sorrow and love could finally breathe. She found a second notebook, thinner entries Jonathan wrote to her, in case she ever found this place. "I didn't want to see the look in your eyes, the one you wear when you think you failed. You didn't. I built this for me, for us. If you're reading this, I'm sorry for what I didn't say." She pressed it to her heart, the ache blending with something softer, understanding, maybe forgiveness. Lynette started writing in the barn, picking up where Jonathan left off, filling the space with words for the child they dreamed of, for Jonathan, for herself. She let light in, cleaned the dust, hung curtains. She found a jar of paper slips, Jonathan's imagined names for their child, each with a trait, a dream. She placed the jar on the shelf, a constellation of the lives they'd never lived. The world outside noticed her change, neighbors waving brighter, the librarian inviting her to help with story hour, the grocery clerk remarking she looked more herself again. Lynette wasn't healed, but she was present. She volunteered at the foster agency, read stories to children, helped where she could. Not to replace Jonathan or fill an absence, but because love like his needed somewhere to go. One afternoon, while reading to a group of kids, a boy crawled into her lap. She held him, feeling the quiet opening of a door inside her. That night, Lynette sat in the barn, notebook open. "You never lived in this house, not the way we dreamed, but you lived in him. And now you live in me. You are loved. That makes you real." She stepped into the night. Barn door left ajar, starlight spilling in. The hush of the prairie wrapped around her like a promise. Out here, Life and loss walk side by side, but sometimes if you're willing to open the door, you find that love doesn't end with goodbye. It waits for you in the places you're most afraid to look. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And tell me, what do you think? Is there ever a secret worth keeping if it's born from love, or should the truth always have its day? I want to hear your thoughts on justice, on forgiveness, on what we owe each other when the doors finally open.